capabilities.
First, let me introduce you, then we can move on.
All right. Let me know when you all want me to go.
Oh,
Okay.
we'll let her present you first, and then you're all good to go.
Okay, so
Sounds good. Thank you.
thank you for being back. Now we have another presentation by Yazan Za3za3 and Tracy Shigo. Yazan is a community-based researcher and organizer from Southern California, currently working as a lecturer for the California State University system. So please, a big round of applause for Yazan Za3za3.
Hello. Can folks hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Cool. My colleague Tracy Ishigo is not going to be joining me today, but just so folks know, my name is Yazan, and I work with an organization called Vigilant Love, which is based out of Los Angeles. And a lot of our work looks at the structural impacts of Islamophobia, with a particular emphasis on the examination of Islamophobic policies and mental health resources. So a lot of our work right now is focusing on the examination of national security apparatuses in mental health resources across the United States, as well as a localized effort in Los Angeles. So just so folks get an idea, that's kind of where we're coming from, is really looking at how do mental health healing, mental health justice, healing justice work together, and how does political violence and oppression work in a way that creates trauma that needs to be addressed. And because of state violence and how trauma is created, how are there ways that sometimes state-sponsored resources are actually responsible for creating more violence or creating harm that can't actually be addressed, for example, by public institutions. And so I think that where I would like to start is just giving folks a general sense of a little bit about the program that we're working with and on. And I think a colleague of mine as well, Jordan, is also going to be here presenting on this program more in depth. But just for starters, what we are really looking at Vigilant Love is the relationship between surveillance, mental health access, and then ways of preventing people from being further harmed by the state through national security involvement in mental health resources. And so just so folks have a sense of what I'll be going over today, going to do a brief timeline of just where the Department of Homeland Security comes from, where Countering Violent Extremism comes from, and then the campaign that we have devised as a result in response to that. And so for starters, I think it's important to really lay down that DHS is something that is a fairly recent phenomenon in US political context. So even though a lot of us maybe have had the Department of Homeland Security in our lives for a majority of it, the Department of Homeland Security originates in 2002 and 2003 from 9/11. And so it is a physical entity that has a lot of pull in terms of legal influence, policing influence, and other types of legislative efforts that specifically really is developing in response to and from the war on terror. So it's something that is very, very much sitting at the heart of like Islamophobic policies in the United States. And so just a brief timeline, you have the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002. You have the creation of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, in 2003. And then down the line between 2003 and 2011, after 9/11, you have a huge uptick in a lot of Islamophobic policies or surveillance programs that get a lot of backlash from civil rights organizations and Muslim communities. And I'm operating under the grace that a lot of folks here are kind of aware of the experiences of Muslim community members given the focus of this specific conference. But there is a lot of repression that's taking place between 2001 and 2010 of really forward, blatant, brash types of surveillance programs like NCERS, registrar lists, the Patriot Act, and stuff like that. And in 2011, you have this program called Countering Violent Extremism that is a pilot program that starts to be discussed and implemented across the United States. And at that time, the program's basic model was, okay, community is not happy with how we are approaching them with the ways that we are utilizing intelligence and surveillance. It is creating a lot of community tensions and distrust. What is a way we can restructure surveillance so that community does not feel threatened or harmed? Like, this is the impetus for the program that is called Countering Violent Extremism. And at the time, the US government itself was very split on the program. They were very skeptical. But you have the Boston bombing, you have the San Bernardino shooting, and you have the Pulse shooting 2013, 2015, 2016. And that leads to a huge escalation in a public focus and emphasis on the idea of fighting terrorism in the United States again. On a domestic level, people are really, really invested all of a sudden on a public level in we need something to address this. And so there, Congress becomes very, very inflamed on the idea of launching countering violent extremism and moving forward with it. And so right at the cusp of the Pulse shooting, you have government reports citing the San Bernardino shooting, the Pulse shooting, and the Boston bombing regularly as catalysts for the creation of this program called Countering Violent Extremism. And so from 2016 through to 2018, then 2020, 2021, you have a series of multi-million-dollar grants being administered in the name of this program. And so you don't have to memorize all of this, but just for the context of really where countering violent extremism is coming from historically, and that it's a very recent history that's tied to 9/11 and the launch of the war on terror. And so something that's kind of important for us in our discussions and our framing around the relationship between mental health and the war on terror, right? Like, these are things that maybe sound very different, or it's like they sound like they're in different realms. But something that we've been tracking Vigilant Love alongside other organizations like Muslim Justice League, like the Palestinian Youth Movement, and a lot of really critical scholars and mental health professionals in the United States, is actually looking at how mental health and more broadly community wellness is a really, really big focal point of institutions like the Department of Homeland Security, like local police precincts, like the US military. You will see a lot of reference to community wellness, community resilience, mental health, care, these kinds of things across the board in all of these institutions. And so a lot of our interest has been why? Why are these spaces that are usually the ones creating and fostering the violent situations that our communities are responding to, why are they talking so much about mental health? Why are they talking so much about community wellness? Like, is there actually an investment in these things? And so what we've been mapping out more consistently, and this is through also like a lot of research put in by other folks, by other organizers, by other scholars, is looking at how does mental health wellness fit into a larger conversation of something called the terror industrial complex. And for folks who aren't familiar, the terror industrial complex is something that's coined by a scholar named Jamil Ahmed, but it's something that he uses to really explain how the war on terror is really different than other wars that the United States has ever been involved in. And I know that in some ways this maybe sounds like a tangent or something, but the war on terror really has changed how communities who are impacted by war experience war. And a big part of that is because whereas historically in the United States, when the United States is at war, it's at war with an explicit country. The war on terror is a moment where it's everywhere. Sorry, it's ubiquitous. The war on terror exists domestically, it exists abroad. Anyone can be a terroristic threat. Anyone can be an enemy to the state. And it's primarily in relationship to their political and religious identities. And so you have, through the war on terror, the creation of ICE, the expansion of policing and immigration, the expansion of surveillance, the expansion of war. And in that, you also have the expansion of community resources through these groups, through these organizations. So now the Department of Homeland Security is like, we are going to start paying attention to these spaces. We are going to start funding these spaces to have more access to community in this way. And I think of special note is actually that Joe Biden is someone who's very heavily invested in the creation of programs like Countering Violent Extremism. Historically, he's also someone who created a program in the 1990s called COPS, which is community-oriented policing services. And so I'm putting this here because a lot of times when we think of surveillance, when we think of the experiences of repression from the government, it's usually something that we attribute to the conservative bloc or the right wing or Republicans. But it's actually been a huge initiative of the Democratic Party in the United States to put police and community in regular contact. And so the basic model that Joe Biden and people under his kind of vein of thought have been using is community doesn't trust police because there are some bad police officers. Community doesn't trust the FBI because there are some bad FBI agents. But police themselves overall are good. The FBI overall is good. And because of that, we just need to have better relationships between the police and the community. And that's kind of the line of thought that the Democratic Party uses. And through that, they've been working really hard to create programs that are funding grants that put money into local police precincts that then the police use to fund community organizations. And the requirements of those grants will be, hey, we're the police, we will fund you X number of dollars as a nonprofit in our city. And the rule is you need to have 5 regular meetings with us over the span of a year. And you need to discuss your community in depth with us or things like that. That's COPS, that's community-oriented policing services. That's kind of the model of the program. And it'll be usually done in ways that are good. Like they will give out bikes to community members in Minneapolis and say, we're doing something that's really benevolent. A lot of community members who can't afford bikes are very stoked. But at the same time, what it's doing is putting community regularly in contact with police. Countering violent extremism is a really similar model, but it's expanding on that and is specifically going through the war on terror. So whereas this other program that I was talking about is kind of more about racialized communities and racialized poverty generally, countering violent extremism is explicitly focusing on race and religion, and then at times socioeconomic status and immigration status. And so what it does is it's putting community in contact with the federal agents. And the basic model is community stopped really trusting police and federal agents after 9/11. There was a huge uptick in reports and surveys being done of communities saying, I don't trust these entities, I'm not working with them anymore. You had Muslim communities in different parts of the United States who no longer allowed police or ambulances to enter apartment complexes. They were like, if you want to come talk to one person, we will send that person down. You are no longer allowed into our buildings, which started to pose a health threat because people who were having medical crises then had to start being carried down apartment buildings to be taken to see ambulances where police are showing up, right? Things like that. So this distrust, a lot of federal agents were like, we need to address this. Like we need access to community information. We need to keep track of extremism or terrorism in communities. How do we break through the fact that community no longer trusts us to engage them directly? And so countering violent extremism led to the creation of this model, which is the utilization of a middleman. Whereas before, the FBI, police, and other federal agents would kind of try and work with informants in community or go talk to community directly and try to approach them. That stopped working. So the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security were like, what if we use a mediator? What if we use community partners? What if we use religious institutions, nonprofits? What if we use schools? What if we use hospitals? All of these spaces that community already trusts, where they already know someone, where they're already going to be able to openly talk about things relating to their day-to-day life. What if these are the people that we keep regular contact with? What if these are the people who become the major sources of our information on community on governance? And so this is where the idea for countering violent extremism really, really starts to take off. It leads to the mass funding of different organizations, different institutions, right, across the United States. And the way that it works is you have a grant that the Department of Homeland Security will offer, let's say, a religious institution or a nonprofit specializing in mental health resources. This grant will come from the Department of Homeland Security, go to these institutions, and the requirements are the institutions have to use the money to implement programming that specifically will address extremism and will target explicitly potential extremists, which are usually folks who are identified based on their socio-political identity, their religion, their race, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic class, and so forth. And so the way it's working is it's putting DHS at the heart of every single community center. And for folks who aren't familiar, for example, maybe with the day-to-day life of Muslim refugees who are the primary targets of these programs, A lot of refugees will use anywhere from 2 to 10 nonprofits and other public institutions in the span of a week, right? A lot of folks are going to nonprofits for legal aid, for mental health resources, for vocational training, for support with things like bills and getting welfare, for access to food, hygiene kits, right? These kinds of things. So funding these institutions specifically is a really intentional choice because they're the most frequented by Muslim refugees who are identified as the primary targets and the original impetus of countering violent extremism. And so I think that something that's really important is thinking about how mental health is weaponized in these programs. And so I think they identify explicitly mental health as an indicator of something that can tell you whether or not someone is likely to commit an extremist crime. And this is something that specifically Vigilant Love has taken a lot of qualms with because what you have happening, I'll actually go back a few slides, is with how it's playing out, you will have either surveillance or war taking place in certain places. You will have places like Somalia or Syria that are heavily militarized, being bombed out by the United States. You will have refugees leave, come to the United States, and in the United States, they will receive services that are funded by the Department of Homeland Security, where their political activity and their religious identity is being surveilled. If they are identified as a threat, then they are referred back to federal agencies or local police, where they are at risk of being deported, of being criminalized or pathologized. The intelligence that's collected from these then goes back into researching and assessing threats to US political policies in these different countries. And then it continues this cycle of militarization and things like that. And so you have mental health being identified as a place where you can really get to know community members in depth, and you can identify how community is thinking about federal agencies. And more importantly, you can pathologize them or criminalize them for having mental health diagnoses and politics that are critical of the United States, for example. And so what you see happening is community members who are depressed, who have anxiety, who have PTSD, are identified as potential extremist threats and more likely to be referred back to federal agencies, even though the fact or the reason for their depression, anxiety, and PTSD is war itself, or being a poor refugee who doesn't have access to resources in the United States because of racism and xenophobia. You have community disenfranchisement and resource insecurity identified as driving factors of extremism by the Department of Homeland Security, but there's no resources that are being given to community except through grants like Countering Violent Extremism, which require the involvement of the Department of Homeland Security. You have the structural realities of racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia being untouched entirely by these programs. So the harassment, the violence, the racism that community is experiencing and usually politically responding to that is being called an extremist threat is never addressed. So the sources of community frustration and the sources of community oppression are things that are never actually seen as legitimate. So what's happening is community members are incurring a lot of mental health trauma and needing access to resources in ways that they're not actually able to receive from the current model in the United States. A lot of public funding to Muslim refugee communities primarily has been cut because of the expansion of Department of Homeland Security funding. So what does it mean when a community member who's traumatized by war, is frustrated by the fact that they're displaced by United States militarism, goes to a therapist to try to talk about it, and is referred back to federal agencies for their frustration with United States military policy, right? And so I won't go in depth here because I don't have time, but we have done a lot of examination of the relationship between the National Association of Social Workers, right, Code of Ethics, and the ways that countering violent extremism asks practitioners to go against those, right? If you're thinking of things like the Hippocratic Oath, if we also have looked in depth at California state requirements for social workers, for other types of service providers, a lot of the ways that CVE is operating in terms of privacy rights, in terms of the protection of clients' well-being, those are the things that are foregone by CVE. And I think because we started a bit late, I'm shorter on time than I knew I was. So I don't know if it makes the most sense to pause here. I think the parts about the mental health impacts were things that I was hoping to go into more. I didn't realize that we had shortened time. So I don't know if you all want me to pause here and come back to go more in depth with mental health impacts after Jordan presents during the Q&A.
Presenting for 5 more minutes if you like.
Okay, so I think with the way that countering violent extremism is playing out in the United States, it's based off another program called Prevent in the UK. And they both use really similar models of identifying mental health as both a space to find people who are more likely to be extremists, and also using mental health as a way to identify people themselves as extremist threats. And so a lot of qualitative research has been done looking at the experiences of both patients and service providers working in these kinds of contexts, right? And so you have different anecdotes that have been collected by researchers who are trying to really understand, is this program something that is supportive of patient healing? And so one of the anecdotes or one of the vignettes that's coming out of a qualitative study done by a couple of practitioners themselves, right? Dr. Taudat Yunus is one of them, is looking at the case of someone who's identifying as a survivor of domestic abuse. And so this person who's identifying as a survivor of domestic abuse is coming to seek therapy for working through the trauma of being a survivor. During that time, naturally on the side becomes someone who is seeing someone that is Muslim, starts to identify with Islam, decides to convert, decides to wear the hijab, the veil, right? And starts to take an interest in learning Arabic to be able to better study the Quran. And in that moment, what this person reported to the qualitative researchers is that her therapist started focusing on that and started asking her more questions about why she's doing these things, what her political intention is with becoming more religious, and why she chose Islam, why she chose to veil. Is this something she chose, or did her partner choose it for her? And so this person started to feel pressured and decided to leave therapy because they're like, okay, like I am not actually being seen for the things that I'm coming to talk about, which is my trauma from physical violence. I'm now being pathologized and criminalized, because there's an awareness that other people like this person had already been referred. And so what you have happening is you have on the other side of it, practitioners who are also either enacting these things that are calling patient well-being into question. And then you have service providers who are also tied, their hands are tied by national security laws that are no longer allowing for people to prioritize patient well-being. And so this is an anecdote of one of the practitioners on an interdisciplinary team who had questions about the treatment of their client, who was a survivor seeking these resources. And this person was like, wait, we are prioritizing this alleged inclination towards extremism over the things that this patient is actually talking to us about, which is being depressed from having experienced violence, being anxious, having a lot of issues navigating day-to-day life. Like these are the things that we are being seen for. And these are not the things that we're discussing at length when we discuss the treatment plan of this client. What is happening here? And so you have practitioners who've been leaving the field in response to the expansion of national security reporting into mental health resources. And I'm happy to go over this more in depth in the Q&A. I can pause here, just I want to give time to Jordan as well.
Okay. All right. Jordan's here. All right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Yazan. Round of applause, please.
So now we have another presenter, Mr. Jamil Ahmed. He is the organizing director at Muslim Justice League and serves as the membership coordinator. He organizes local communities who are directly impacted by criminalization and discrimination. So please give a round big of applause to Mr. Jamil.
Thank you. Thank you. One second. I'm going to share my screen. Let me pull up. Me do. It looks like I need to do it through my desktop. One second. Thank you for your patience. Okay, I think it should work now. Let me make this bigger. Okay, so thank you again for that introduction. Again, my name is Jordan Jamil Ahmed. I am the organizing director at Muslim Justice League. We are a grassroots community-based community organization in Boston, and we focus on a lot of what Yazan was talking about in terms of countering violent extremism and seeing how the national security surveillance state impacts Muslims locally and also nationally in regards to our national Stop CVE campaign. I'm gonna just get us in here. So I'm really gonna be speaking mostly to our health justice team's work. We've been doing a case study on a threat assessment team here in Boston that we've done some public records requests on, that we've found the ways that it's harmed people locally. So we're really trying to hone in on a lot of the big topics that Yazan was talking about with CVE and the broader DHS framework and how it impacts a specific case and the ways that has implications for how CVE is proliferating under these threat assessment teams that were previously seen more as like multidisciplinary teams. And our health justice team, it's been active since 2016, and it works to educate and organize the health sector. It's made up of health professionals, health policy advocates, mental health professionals, and organizers, hoping to help health professionals understand CVE and why it's harmful, and to encourage conversations within the institutions about ethical responses and about ethical responses, and to secure pledges to not work with CVE. And the goal of this specifically is to talk about how threat assessment teams actualize the CVE frameworks. I'm going to skip this really quick and just dive right in. Yazan gave a really great framework of CVE, so I'm not going to go into I'm not going to cover the history in the same way that they did, but I will go into a little bit more specific details about CVE itself. So it's a racist Islamophobic framework that's driven by national security and federal law enforcement that claims to prevent violence. But we know that CVE does not prevent violence. And in fact, it outsources policing to community leaders and helping professionals, recruiting and training them to use racial and religious profiling to further embed law enforcement into our communities. So that includes community members, faith leaders, counselors, teachers, doctors, therapists, and other service providers that are then brought in to monitor their own community members, students, or clients as a form of this like soft policing. It's not supported by sound evidence. It instead relies on this dangerous profiling. And it's based on the false assumption that Muslims and members of other marginalized communities are inherently more prone to violence. The framework is global. In the US, it was first launched under the Obama administration, like Yazan said, and it was framed as an alternative to law enforcement-led anti-terrorism efforts. It's been renamed multiple times in the US, also like Yazan said, specifically to targeted violence and terrorism prevention, that was launched with $10 million in grant funding for local governments, state governments, 501c3s, and institutions of higher learning. And then it also now is called CP3, so the Center for Prevention and Programs and Partnerships. So this has sort of evolved, and even to the point where if you type in dhs.gov/CVE, it will take you to the CP3 page. So whether or not they admit that it's the same, it's clear that there's a direct lineage and that this is just still CVE. So as we talk about it, we continue to call these TVTP and CP3 programs CVE. And the important thing to note in this context is that Boston is one of the 3 pilot cities for CVE, which relates directly to the development of the multidisciplinary team that I'll be talking about. Yazan talked a little bit about the indicators. So this is from earlier versions of CVE, some of the early indicators of violent extremism. And again, you can see how it relates to, having psychological issues. So it's directly woven into the mental health field and is stigmatizing of folks with mental illness or who are struggling with mental health, especially, important to think about in the context of what Yazan was framing with why folks are struggling with mental health to begin with, and what is then bringing them into seeking services, and how those services then are being used against them to monitor them. And also it's important to note that even the DHS themselves say that, you know, having any of these is not actually an indicator of targeted violence or terrorism. So I'm just going to go real briefly through some of CVE's impacts. So, you know, justifying the surveillance of Muslim communities at large, assuming that we're always suspicious, intensifying anti-Muslim, anti-Black, anti-immigrant policies, a lot of these things that I think that you all know, given the population that is here. And also, you know, not only targeting religiosity, but also political activism. And also it's categorizing constitutionally protected behaviors as pre-criminal. So we talk a lot about this pre-criminal sort of space that CVE encompasses, where folks can be criminalized or stigmatized or targeted without actually having committed any crimes. Move forward. So this is an example of some of the protests that we've held and like actions we've held, just saying, you know, I tell my doctor things I wouldn't tell the Joint Terrorism Task Force, for example. And that's where it really, you know, these helping professionals are continually brought into these. So I'm going to be talking more about how it intersects with healthcare, and specifically as it develops into multidisciplinary teams. So all of this, I think you all understand. So it's important to note that multidisciplinary teams are used in many fields. You know, it's very self-explanatory in that folks from various professions come together to solve some sort of problem together. But as it's been brought into the CVE framework, there's a larger focus on incorporation of law enforcement, and with shared responsibility committees and threat assessment teams, which are sort of like advanced versions of multidisciplinary teams, there's a more explicit involvement of federal law enforcement and the FBI specifically. I'll just go back. I'll wait for that for 1 second. So one of the ways that the CVE framework shows up in healthcare and mental health care settings is through these teams. They typically involve, yeah, okay, I guess I went through that. Yes. Thank you. All right, so I want to go into the specific multidisciplinary team that came out of work that was happening at Boston's Children's Hospital, and it's called Community Connect. So this is the multidisciplinary team that we did public records requests on when folks in the community said, we think there's something CVE related going on with these folks. Something happened at ISBCC, which is our local masjid. And come to find out through some investigative journalism that's happening is we think that this all built off of a longitudinal study of Boston Somali youth's propensity for violence that was led by one of the members of Community Connect, who is at Boston Children's Hospital. And we think that that might actually be one of the reasons why Boston was chosen as one of the pilot cities for CVE to begin with. And again, although so Community Connect began kind of as in this response to, there was an incident where an individual in the community was deemed to have sent some sort of threatening voicemails to the community. So they brought together local law enforcement, faith leaders, community leaders, mental health and education professionals to come together around this case that then became formalized into Community Connect. Their goal was to intercept youth that were identified as being on a trajectory toward potential violence or criminal justice involvement. And despite claiming to operate without regard to targeted individuals' race, religion, or cultural background, we know that in practice, all CVE-associated programs disproportionately target members of minoritized races and religions, despite there being no evidence to prove that these individuals are more prone to violence. And also, we believe that based off of who was involved with the Community Connect team, that it is now advanced into the Mass Bay Threat Assessment team. And Community Connect claimed not to work with the FBI, although even in articles that they've written about it themselves, they say that they took referrals from FBI. And with the Mass Bay Threat Assessment team, we believe that they have a more explicit involvement with the FBI. So the health justice team obtained these public records that I was talking about of email exchanges of members of the Community Connect team who were responding to something that they deemed to be a potential threat in the community. In the email exchanges, we see evidence that the individual was singled out for these threatening voicemails that they left, and then subjected to stigmatization of their mental health status and criminalized without having committed any crime. This, again, demonstrates that pre-criminal space that I was talking about before. And specifically with this individual, we see how they experienced direct law enforcement surveillance, a law enforcement visit, and they were hospitalized. And this Community Connect team was interfering in their personal life and contacting people in their life. That it's unclear where confidentiality was held or was not held from the emails. And so all of the work that went into Community Connect and this multidisciplinary team then has sort of advanced into this mass-based threat assessment team. And you can see this is directly from DHS's website, that Boston Children's Hospital has gotten both a $750,000 TVTP grant in 2020 and also another $480,000 grant in 2021, both related to the mass-based threat assessment team. So, there are a lot of really obvious implications and impacts of this, but recruiting mental health care professionals to collaborate in CVE does threaten to erode adherence to ethical obligations, damages trust in health and helping professionals, increases stigma, increases surveillance, chills like Muslim communities' use of health services, worsens racial health disparities, and undermines movements by discouraging activists' use of mental health and other services as well. So I'm just going to read the conclusion of our case study really quickly, to finish us off. So we acknowledge the ways many mental health care structures in America have continued to function as extensions of the medical industrial complex, which has historical roots in surveillance, colonization, and the control and oppression of already marginalized communities. We are aware that mental wellness and mental illness are inextricably linked to historical, political, social, and environmental contexts. The methods in which mental health care is extended to every individual has substantial power in both potentially dangerous and liberating ways. A paradigm of mental health care that is rooted in the values of justice, self-determination, and sustained equitable and dignified relationships is pivotal, especially within the Muslim community. And this paradigm is also endemic to our Muslim faith tradition, as well as ancient Islamic sciences and wisdoms about community care on a global scale. A collaborative effort to work towards better understanding how we can align our collective care practices as closely to these values as possible is an act of both reclamation and liberation-rooted transformation. In this case, we recognize the complex and under-resourced terrain in which professionals charged with facilitating community or individual healing must reckon with. We are also mindful that the team named their approach to their work as community-centered. We offer some observations from this case that shed light on how norms and social forces within some mental health care models, particularly those that actively involve law enforcement, can undermine intentions around community-centered support, especially for and within broader Muslim communities. In conclusion, there is no clinical procedure that can detect risk factors for violent extremism. There has not been concrete evidence or research conducted that shows the validity for the effectiveness of CVE. The National Institute of Health's stage model of psychosocial intervention development requires researchers to test actions and behavioral changes in clinical trials to demonstrate effectiveness before it becomes widely implemented in the public health system. And this has not happened for CVE-inspired programs. There's no blanket immunity or clear protection for mental health professionals who may be sued due to confidentiality violations, and we need to address the needs of our communities without using the CVE framework. Research has not been able to prove that CVE works in preventing violence. Instead, it encourages criminalization and racial and religious profiling. So I will just briefly say to take action. There are ways that you can speak to colleagues and institutions about CVE early to intervene and advocate for clear ethical guidance, especially if you have a sense that something seems CVE-like or is deputizing mental health workers or community members to police themselves. You can follow organizations like MJL and Vigilant Love, or join our National Stop CVE Coalition. Also, don't advocate just like generally for anti-terrorism measures, because even those that purport to target white supremacy or white nationalism often or always end up having a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. And then I'm also going to drop this link in the chat where it links to our CVE and healthcare guide, and you can also follow up with me directly. I will end. Stop sharing. And hopefully now we can use some of the extra time, to talk about some of what Yazan was sharing too.
All right, awesome. Round of applause, everybody.
So I can ask a few questions.
And if anyone wants to text questions on the chat, you may feel free to, either to Jordan or Yazan. We do have some questions from the audience, if you guys don't mind.
So thank you both of you for the wonderful presentation. So I have a question that you mentioned about the discrimination in your slides, and I was wondering how much role the social media plays in that, because like recently we have seen so much violence going on social media, on Facebook and Instagram, and people posting videos and then posting around. Like we remember the incident which happened in New Zealand, where a person was showing the guns. He went in the mosque and killed so many Muslims. So what is your take about that?
Just to be clear, so like a take on the role of social media in these conversations?
Yes. So what do you think your organization is doing about stopping the violence through social media and how it's portrayed on the social media?
So I think there's two things. I think on the one hand, in general, there's a lot of counter narratives that I think all of our organizations are working on in response to Islamophobia and other types of racism and violence and xenophobia that exists, by also, I think, really creating new political narratives and kind of, what's the word, revealing political violence. But I think actually what's more important for this conversation is social media is actually a huge platform as well for countering violent extremism. And I think in addition to what you're talking about, which sounds like maybe more broadly violence and maybe like types of racism or hate rhetoric that exists and social media's promotion of that, it's actually also a place where a lot of surveillance is happening and a lot of political ideas are being surveilled. And there's a lot of money from the Department of Homeland Security specifically going to to organizations that work on, for example, algorithms that track the posts of Muslims and like political ideologies that are critical of the United States and things like that. So while I would say that I think organizations like Muslim Justice League, Vigilant Love, and a lot of other organizations do use social media to try to push different concepts and ideas, I think what's also important is that these programs are also there and are really, really active online.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say that, I mean, you can see really directly the ways that Muslim activists, or especially folks who are organizing around Palestine, have their social media regularly kind of deplatformed or censored in multiple ways. You can see how they'll suddenly get less engagement if they're sharing about the violence that's happening in Palestine specifically. So I think, we try to use social media as a tool to share political education and kind of a counter narrative. But I do think that, we're also very surveilled on social media as well.
Thank you so much. The next question is that you mentioned about the bias which happens through the FBI and the police. And the question is that what about the internalized racism that Muslims already have who are living in North America? So what do you think about that? Like, how is the organization working towards that? Because it's a very big mental health issue, they've already internalized the bias, and how would you address that?
I mean, that's something we see in trying to talk about CVE in the community is, a big narrative that comes from our community. And I think it's because of the fact that we want to be welcoming in some ways is, you know, if we have nothing to hide, why don't we just like let them come? You know, there's nothing that we've done wrong. But the issue is, why do we have to be subjected to that to begin with? And you know, I think it's in the documentary, The Feeling of Being Watched. Asia Bundawi says like, no chai for FBI, like as a way to just sort of like remind us that we don't need to welcome these law enforcement agencies in, and you know, they could sort of like monopolize some of the internalized racism that you're talking about, or internalized Islamophobia. And it's important for us to sort of like continue to counter that. And part of that is through workshops and political education and talking to the community about internalized Islamophobia directly. We often will lead workshops that draw lines from internalized Islamophobia to interpersonal Islamophobia to broader like structural racism and Islamophobia, to see the direct line of how all of them feed each other. So the ways that institutions are Islamophobic feeds into our own internalized Islamophobia, which it just is kind of this vicious cycle.
I think too, just to quickly add to that, expanding on one thing Jordan said, which was that sometimes communities internalize Islamophobia plays a role in inviting law enforcement. CVE, what's really important about it is not everyone has to be blatantly Islamophobic and blatantly on board with the program for it to take place. So what you'll see in different communities, for example, in San Diego, is it only took 1 to 2 people who are very openly like Islamophobic and who are very blatantly like have internalized Islamophobia to bring the program in. But everyone else who was participating in the program and enacting it, and either as a nonprofit worker or a service provider or a university lecturer, all of these people, they were actually people who were like, I want to support the Muslim community. I don't know what's like, they don't know the details. And so I think even though it's a little bit of like a separate thing, I think what's hard is internalized Islamophobia can bring CVE somewhere, but then it's so complicated that it doesn't actually matter whether or not people are Islamophobic for CVE to happen and to play out, which is also really hard to address.
Thank you so much, both of you. We have one last question. Just give us a few minutes. The first one. Okay, so the question is that how can we have discussions about these surveillance factors within our organizations, given that many receive money from these programs?
So something I didn't get a chance to really go into is at Vigilant Love, there's a program called, we have our campaign called Services Not Surveillance. And I think it's also drawing a lot on the work actually of MJL's health justice team. But what community organizations have been working to do is critically building with service providers and with nonprofits that offer these resources to do internal educations to understand, like, this is how the program works, this is what's happening. And right now, I think a lot of our focus in Vigilant Love is on individual providers, therapists, practitioners, etc., to try to teach them, okay, this is how countering violent extremism works. This is how national security laws waive privacy rights that are granted by HIPAA. This is how you as a service provider can move differently in the therapy room. For example, take 2 sets of notes. One that is actually everything about your client that you keep, and one that you use for reporting purposes, where you leave out the things that can get your client deported, or you leave out the things that can get your client incriminated and referred back to federal agents. Or, for example, look into your agency's funding. Are you guys funded by the Department of Homeland Security? when you give your patient a waiver asking them to sign their confidentiality rights in relation to national security, does your organization do that because it's getting a grant that requires it? Is that just a standard like language that they use because it's normal practice and stuff like that? And we also have a value statement that I can link that we encourage folks who are seeking therapy to take to their providers. And we encourage people who are service providers or who work for in nonprofit contexts where maybe they're doing social work and getting a lot of personal information to read through it and learn more and ask these questions about funding. Because I think what's really important about that last question is it is really hard to actually know if you are being funded by the Department of Homeland Security. Money can get changed hands 5 to 10 times. Nonprofits sometimes get money and they don't even know that it originally came from the DHS and that there's legal requirements on it. So really, really encouraging folks to be vigilant and focus on, for now, what role they can play in administering change, whether it be thinking about their clients in a different way, not talking to their clients about certain things, letting their clients know, hey, I just found out we're funded by DHS. You might want to seek services somewhere else, these kinds of things.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit to that. And at NGL, what we're really focused on right now is how we can build out this case study and publish it in order to kind of serve as an example of how this happens and to provide folks with resources on what to do next and to raise awareness around some of these really large campaigns that are happening or large grants that have been given to places like Boston Children's Hospital, because the goal isn't to necessarily just to like call out an institution like Boston Children's for taking on this money, but instead to demonstrate how what they're doing is not in line with their own values. And I think the more that we're able to draw that line, I think the easier it is for folks to understand why something like CVE is so bad. I'm also going to drop in our CVE in healthcare sort of like resource page, along with the resources that Yazan just shared. But yeah, I think that you know, that question really gets to the center of the work, and it is very difficult because of the ways that it's so hard to identify, even if it's like folks themselves struggling to identify where the funding is necessarily coming from and that level of depth.
Okay, I guess we don't, I'm checking the chat right now if there's any other questions. And do you have any other questions from the audience? If not, I guess we'll close up. But I just want to say thank you so much, both of you, both Jordan and both Yazan, for your lovely presentations. We appreciate it very much. One more round of applause, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll put my email in the chat if people want to keep in touch.
Please.
Yeah, please, if anyone wants to learn more, I love one-on-one conversations and would be happy to talk about stuff that you're going through or how, if you want to learn more about any of the things that we've talked about.
Excellent. So we're just gonna have like a quick break, everybody. So at 4:45, we'll have our next discussion. So we'll have a 30-minute break, okay? All right, thank you, gentlemen, appreciate it.